as a kind of selection of generally what we bought, we thought about things that either dry or cure at the hardware store. We didn't even begin to scratch the surface. But that includes, from what we bought paint, okay, which is an ongoing experiment. We additionally bought this paint hardener, which what this is intended for is if you have a gallon of paint that's half empty and you want to throw it away, you're not supposed to just throw that gallon of paint away. You mix this stuff into it and it solidifies the paint. And the results are a little weird, but we think maybe promising. It's just going to take longer than we expected for it to truly dry. But you can see it's solid, it's just kind of spongy in there, so we haven't quite gotten anything that we can use quite yet, but we think there's something to this. And it's super interesting. We kind of haven't seen anybody mess around with that before. We bought Plaster of Paris, which we gave a few demos on, and this stuff is kind of the most intuitive material that we're using. We're not using this in any way that it's not intended for, really. We bought some silicone caulk. This stuff is obviously gonna dry, right? So we can kind of squirt this around on top of something and it'll ultimately cure. Gorilla Glue. Concrete is kind of similar to Plaster of Paris in that, like, it is just intended to be used in this way. And so that being said, there's also a ton of like YouTube videos of people doing kind of interesting stuff with concrete and with plaster. And tape, ultimately for kind of fiddling around with making molds, which we have yet to really dive into, but that's kind of up next. And then we went to Walmart and we just bought a bunch of items to help us kind of cast into or kind of paint the materials on top of. So these are really handy. Most of these materials aren't going to stick to most plastics very well anyhow, so they kind of have like an automatic mold release. We did, with the silicone experiment, we did use a chunk of wax to wax the inside of the bowl, kind of knowing that silicone is going to stick to this plastic. Even if it's not like chemically bonded, mechanically it would be on there so well that we'd never get it off. So we used like a block of wax. We actually recommend using paste wax instead of paraffin. And you can just coat the whole inside of the bowl or whatever you're casting onto, and that'll make things release really well. But keep in mind, if you use paste wax as a mold release for plaster, for example, the plaster is going to have like a skin of wax on it afterwards, and that might prohibit things from sticking to it later. So one thing we also recommend, getting a lot of these, probably in varying sizes. Probably one smaller than this. This is a 1 quart. I kind of wish we had a pint as well, because it would have been graduated a little smaller in a little finer increments. And if you really want to get technical with all of this, which we didn't go this kind of granular, but having a little scale would be really beneficial for mixing these things really accurately. And like I said, we bought a bunch of bowls. This allowed us to do kind of a 2-part mold situation. And like I said, kind of our next kind of experiment would be refining this paint a little bit more, or a lot more, and really investigating mold making. The video of Phil Cutton's is this really kind of captivating way of making molds that are really quick and iterative. But there's also kind of this infinite world of mold making, particularly from ceramics, that really kind of opens your world up to intent. So, real quick, a concept of draft. A lot of what we're doing is making like really, really crude molds, or using other objects as really crude molds. And this idea of draft is the kind of walls of the mold and the angle at which they are, and that helps to release the object that you've cast into it, or trap it if on accident. So I cast this thing in plaster into this plate, and you can see the plate is like practically flat. The walls are, 45 degrees, under 45 degrees, right? So that has a ton of draft, the theory of draft, right? This cup, for example, the walls are much closer to parallel, much less draft. And even between these two, so I cast this into the plate, I poured this around this bowl. Even this was notably harder to get apart than the plate, all right? the cup becomes really difficult. If I was to cast, you can imagine if I filled this with plaster, right? It's got this is called an undercut. We would never get the plaster out of this. We basically have to cut the bottle apart. There is a weird thing with something like a mug, okay? If we cast a mug in ceramic into a mold, keep in mind these walls are parallel, but ceramic has this unusual property in that it shrinks a tiny bit as it dries, and that actually will pull it away from the wall. So if I took the same mold that made this and I cast plaster into it instead of ceramic, or I cast concrete into it instead of ceramic, they'd be stuck because this has zero draft. So kind of keep that in mind. We're going to fiddle around a little bit with molds, including this concrete thing that's buried, in which we're not worried about draft because we're basically going to destroy the mold in order to get our part out of it. The work that is shown in the Phil Cuttins video that you guys have seen is the same way. He's making these molds that have no draft or have kind of negative draft and a lot of undercuts. And to get his part out, you see in the video, he has to take the mold apart around it.
So yesterday we did some experiments to give ourselves an idea of what we were going to get into with all of this. And we didn't know what we had expectations, but we didn't know what our outcome was going to be. And that's kind of the fun part about this. And after every experiment, we can kind of gather the information that we learned, and then we can make another experiment and see if we can affect something the way we want it or change some aspect of it to manipulate the final outcome. And so in our Gorilla Glue experiment yesterday, we took a big bowl and we filled it with Gorilla Glue, and there was so much glue in here that it took really long to dry, and you can see how much it foamed up in the center, right? It's maybe up to 2 inches at some points in the inside of this, and then the outside, where it was tight against the bowl, is nice and smooth and kind of glossy. Where it's still orangey, it's not quite dry, but that will happen over time. This thing is pretty strong. Like, I'm trying to squeeze it pretty good, and it's not. I could probably break it up here where it's thinner, but if you did this correctly and like you did multiple layers and you kind of got the thickness even all the way around, you could make a pretty cool bowl this way, or some sort of other object, really whatever you can imagine. Some plaster experiments yesterday talking about like molds. We were trying to do some 2-part molds. So we wanted to do a cup and a cup, and the way to get these 2 cups centered, we drilled a hole in the inside of it and we stuck a dowel through it. But the walls were so thin, even with this in here, I'll show you how deep we had it. Anyways, that dowel was in that hole, and in this one, and we had this cup sticking up about this far, which gave us about, I don't know, maybe 1/8 of an inch thick walls. But at the bottom, it was, closer to 1 inch thick, so it didn't dry evenly. And just in the nature of wiggling this to get the 2 pieces apart, it cracked a bunch, and so that kind of failed. But that would just dictate like the way we tried that experiment the next time if we wanted to change something or go to a different method. And so we did another 2-part experiment with some bowls that we got from Walmart. We got like 7 bowls for $4 or something crazy like that. And we basically mixed 2 colors. John mixed up yellow, I mixed up pink, and we kind of just started pouring them into the big bowl with the tongue depressors, and started mixing it around and blending it. And if you like sanded back through here further, it would uncover more yellow, because I think we were just going a little crazy with the pink at first. And then after we had all the plaster in our cups inside this bowl, we just took the next one and kind of squeezed it down until it looked like it was even all the way around, and until it was about the same level at the top, hoping that the bottom would be about the same thickness as well. This wanted to float, so we filled it with water to kind of weigh it down, and we just let that dry, and cracked off, a little bit around the rim to get it out. But you could now take sandpaper and you could like sand this to clean this edge up to make it, a little bit more friendly. Maybe you like the look that it is now. You could even take and sand the inside or the outside, and you could sand it to a polish even, and maybe get a little bit nicer of a result than what we got here. So that has some potential. We also grabbed some caulking, and we took some silicone caulking that was black, and we tried to put it in this bowl, and it looks really cool. I'm happy with the way it laid in here, But the nature of silicone is that it's really rubbery. And so as I pull this, you can see there's still, like it hasn't fully cured. There was like a dry layer on the outside, but the inside's still wet. And it wants to stick to a lot of things. So I would have coated this thing in a lot more wax than we would have. We also bought construction adhesive that we know dries hard. But this stuff also sticks like crazy to just about anything you put it on. So if I were to repeat this experiment, I would maybe try one of these clear plastic bowls instead of this injection molded bowl. And then I would also just coat the inside of this with paste wax before trying it. And just using a caulking gun, we kind of just drew a spiral as we went along.